My name's Louise. I'll be giving an introduction to Dockstore, containers, and WDL. I work at the UC Santa Cruz Genomics Institute, where I'm a software engineer on Dockstore. So for today, the learning objectives for this presentation is to introduce the Dockstore platform and its features for sharing tools and workflows, and understand how these tools and workflows are packaged using containers, descriptors, and parameter files. This includes an introduction to the workflow description language, or WDL, and to understand how Dockstore helps make research reproducible. We'll also learn more about how Dockstore fits into the Anvil ecosystem today. So first off, what is Dockstore? Let me give you the full description. Dockstore is a free and open source platform for sharing scientific tools and workflows. It's a registry of Docker-based resources described using workflow languages like CWL, WDL, Nextflow, and soon, at the end of this month, Galaxy. So our goals are to increase the portability, interoperability, and reproducibility of research in the sciences. Portability means workflows should run in any environment that supports Docker. And for interoperability, we follow the GA4GH API standards to allow users to use their preferred compute and data storage environments for analysis. So most importantly is reproducibility. Dockstore is a place for researchers and developers to share their work so others can use it. The combination of using containers and workflow languages minimizes redundant and error-prone installation, which increases the transparency of methods used in analysis that allows others to verify the results and apply existing methods into their own research. But in simple terms, like, what is Dockstore? It's a platform for sharing research software. You can think of it as an app store for bioinformatics. So that brings us to, how is Dockstore actually useful and what kinds of problems does it solve? As our first example, let's go over the simplest use case, search and findability. A researcher wants to do some type of genomics work, whether that be assembly, alignment, variant calling, or entire genome-wide association study. This researcher wants to know what software can be used for the job, what works with their data, where do they download that software, and what version should they use. Well, this brings us to Dockstore's function as a registry. So Dockstore is a searchable and centralized catalog of bioinformatic tools and workflows. This means that content on Dockstore can be hosted from multiple locations. It can come from GitHub, Bitbucket, Quay, Docker Hub, and descriptors of workflows can even be hosted directly on Dockstore itself. So all these resources, wherever they might live on the internet, and these repositories are aggregated together on Dockstore to form a centralized library that leads to a better user experience and functionality. Currently, we have about 650 workflows and tools registered on Dockstore, and these come from all over the research community. So to find content on Dockstore, you can make use of Dockstore search functionality. So we have a search interface, which lets you search for tools by the name of the tool, the organization, the author, the descriptor type. You can filter through facets or search for specific organizations. For example, if you use the search functionality to look for things like TopMed or GATK, quite a few entries might pop up. Some results, some content might be from the official organization, and some content are customized versions made by other users. So for example, if you search GATK, probably over 70 results pop up. But we have another feature that Beth went into a little earlier about how to use Dockstore's features, organizations, and collections to find more workflows that are actually showcased by the groups that created them. So the organization features makes it easier for groups to showcase their work and collaborate with others. And collections, like Beth said, are groups of tools or workflows highlighted by an organization. It's sort of like a playlist to bundle up content together for a variety of purposes. For example, a team working together can make a collection of the specific workflows they're using for a project or analysis. This can make sure that all the collaborators or reviewers in that group are using the proper software, proper algorithms, and the versions that they want to do for analysis. Within the organizations feature, there's permission-based roles for members of an organization to allow for control over who can edit the page, who can add members, and who can create and add workflows to specific collections. And like that said, there is a markdown description that's available both on the landing page for the organization and within each of the individual collections of the organization. You can do things like show figures, describe what the tools do, or link to workspaces in the Terra environment, etc. So now that I've shown you how you can use Dockstore for sharing and searching, another reason to use Dockstore is to simplify the installation process of these tools themselves. So these issues with installation and just getting tools is just as common as findability issues, but they're definitely more frustrating. So in this case, a researcher might already know what software they want to use for analysis, but they run into a ton of problems installing that software for a variety of reasons. For example, the tool was built on a different operating system. It might have build issues, it might have trouble installing, or the files just simply don't run when ported to a different computer environment. You can also, tons of different types of dependency problems can also arise from installation. For example, software requires a different version than one installed on the machine. This is a very common case in Java and Python dependencies, for example. Or you're using multiple tools to have the same dependency, but require different versions of that dependency. It's very common to have Python 2 and Python 3 issues, and I'm sure we're familiar with that. So Dockstore solves these problems by the way it packages content. So the environment for a piece of software is packaged up using Docker containers. And Docker containers contain all the code, dependencies, and the operating system used to run that software. That the script that actually outlines how to run the analysis is written in descriptor languages, such as CWL, WDL, and Xflow. I'll go into more details about how containers and descriptors work soon. The main takeaway here is that the combination of using both containers and descriptors resolves the common installation problems at the same time making analysis portable. So you can move your analysis from cloud to cloud, VM to VM, server to server, or any mix and match of these combinations. And it will still be guaranteed as long as the machine supports Docker. So I just want to point out that we are also currently experimenting to how to support other container technologies like Singularity, UDocker, and how to convert from different container types to another. So that's something you can look forward to in the future. Okay, so let's go over more details on containers, descriptors, and parameter files. I'll describe how each one of these pieces fit together conceptually, and then also go over some concrete examples. So, like I said before, a container is a package of code with all its dependencies. A container has everything the software needs to run. This allows for portable software that runs quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. So here's a concrete example of what this packaging actually looks like. First, I'll do some jargon clarification. Images and containers are sometimes used interchangeably, like those terms. But without going into debate with whether or not that's correct, just know that an image is more like a snapshot, a frozen file, and a container is actually what's running in your environment. So the images of containers are built from Docker files. And on the right over here, I put in an example Docker file that is used to package up an environment that has some software tools for it. So when you create a Docker file, you first start off by building it off a base image. One of the common base images is actually the base image for the operating system you'd like to use. So for here, I have an Ubuntu version 18.04. And then in this Docker file, I've installed some dependencies that I need to run my software. So these are just packages that are packages and dependencies for the overall environment, things like compilers, programming languages, etc. To make sure that everything is in this environment when I actually need it. And finally, I've installed the actual analysis software that I'm going to use. Sometimes you can install software directly from a package manager, and that's pretty nice. So I've installed BWA, Tabix, DCF tools directly from the APT package manager. But sometimes you have to install software manually, which can be troublesome, and that's one of the reasons why it's better if a developer can package this up for you so that you can just find this image and run it in your environment. So in this place, in this example Docker file, running getting the installation of SAM tools manually, and then you can also include the scripts or the commands that you need to run that to complete the installation and make sure that your environment is ready for that container setup. So basically, this simple file, not very simple, but in the scope of relativity, I guess, will create the environment that's needed to run all the software you need for your analysis. So next we have the descriptor. A descriptor is the workflow language used to run your pipeline. So now that you've packaged everything up, how do you actually use it? Basically, so the descriptor's purpose is to outline what you actually do with the software that you just packaged in your containerized environment. I've underlined scripts here to emphasize in the descriptor, that's exactly what a descriptor is. It's just a more mature form of like the bash scripts or R scripts that people might be more familiar with. So the purpose of the descriptor is to just outline programmatic instructions or steps to run your software, including saying which containers to use, what steps to run and when, to define some parameters like input and output data or compute requirements for your analysis, and maybe some metadata like authorship or contact information. So if users have questions, they might be able to contact you and answer, and for you to answer. I want to clarify here that in your descriptor, the main purpose is to define parameterized values. So your descriptor can act as a template and be reused for multiple purposes. And the parameter file actually completes this entire picture. It's usually in JSON or YAML format, which basically means it's just a text file that has key value pairs. And by key, what we mean is that the parameters are mapped to the placeholders that are in the descriptor. So, and the values in that key value pair are the actual things that the actual content that you want to fill in the blanks with. So for example, in your descriptor, you'll say, I need a BAM file, or I need a reference file, or I need some amount of memory or some amount of disk. And in your parameter file, you'll say, I want this particular parameter, I want this particular BAM file, like from a specific sample, or I want this version of a reference, or I want like 100 gigabytes of memory, a lot, or disk space. So concretely, these values are file paths or URLs to that research in terms of files, or they might actually just be the string or integer values for whatever variables you're trying to fill in. So I'm going to go over an example of descriptors and parameter files concretely using the workflow description language, aka WDL. So WDL is an open source scripting language which allows you to specify data processing workflows in a human readable and writable syntax. Terra runs WDL workflows, hence workflows compatible with the Anvil ecosystem are written in WDL. And Cromwell is a workflow management system geared towards scientific workflows, which basically means it's the actual thing, the actual execution engine that understands WDL. It'll basically translate your WDL in a way that the computer can understand. Both WDL and Cromwell were initially developed at the Broad Institute for genomics work, but since then, both of these have spun off into open source projects with contributors from both the Broad Institute and also the wider research community. So what's exactly in a WDL? Let's start with the basics. Here I'll give you an overview of the 3 top-level components that make up the core structure of a WDL script. Just to remember that WDL has many features that you can do, that you can use to do some cool analysis that I might not cover today. But my goal is specifically to go over some basic fundamentals so you can understand the more powerful features when you eventually dive through the WDL documentation or other resources later, and to also help you understand how to read the existing workflows that are available on Dockstore and the Broad Methods repository. So the first component is the workflow component. This is the code block that defines the overall workflow. You can think of this as, I like to think of this as an outline for my entire WDL script. This is denoted with a workflow keyword, and then you give a name for your workflow. Very creative, my workflow name. In your workflow block, you can optionally specify input parameters, and this depends on the overall structure of your WDL script and what kind of analysis you can do. It's not always required. But for example, if you're building something a little more complex with inputs that might be reused in multiple steps or for multiple purposes, you may want to specify some inputs that are at the workflow level. But one thing you do want to specify are the outputs of your workflow. So basically to specify what are the outputs that you actually want to keep to signal to Cromwell that Cromwell should keep track of these outputs and save them somewhere. There are some outputs that come from different steps of your pipeline that are more intermediate, and maybe they're not things that you necessarily want to keep and shore up some disk space for. But the outputs you specify here at the workflow level are definitely the things that you want Cromwell to keep track of and provision to a bucket, etc. Second component, at the top level component of a WDL script, is the call. So calls are also located within a workflow block, and they're meant to call a task. Basically, they're saying, I want to run this task, I want to run this action. You can optionally specify some inputs to pass to the task. And this is, in some cases, you might want to do this. For example, if you want to pass some of the workflow level inputs to a specific task, or if you want to use the outputs of a previous task as the inputs of another task. And I want to just emphasize here that when you call to a task, you're not actually defining that task in depth. The purpose of the call block, like I said, the workflow level is kind of like the outline for your entire WDL script. Your call is just saying, run this, run this. The actual tasks are the third core top-level component of a WDL script. And these task definitions, which I'll go into depth soon, are basically everything you need to perform an action. So the task block will define all the necessary inputs, outputs, the commands, the runtime that are required to perform an action. And like I said, these are located outside your workflow block because these task definitions can get quite lengthy. So let's zoom in into a task definition and see what it's all about. So like I said, it defines all the information necessary to perform an action. Well, what do I mean by action? The command is that action. And the command is similar to the shell commands that you type into at a command line. And these commands are parameterized and will be run in the execution environment when your WDL is run. So the task block encloses the command with all the context needed in a parameterized way. So for example, the inputs to the command line, the input to the command, the outputs to the command, and the runtime it needs. And if you notice, all the inputs and the outputs must be typed. For example, file, string, integer, etc. And the runtime environment, not all these parameters are necessary, but for example, I can specify a Docker container. I can specify specific compute parameters that might be needed to run this command or things that I want to run this command based on my data. I just want to emphasize that these are that in your task and your WDL in general, you are defining parameterized values, which are placeholder requirements. And by parameterizing these values or using like the variables, this allows for the flexibility, reuse, and repurposing of your WDL script for future uses. So example, if you want to switch out your data, if you want to mix and match and import tasks into different WDL scripts, etc. So this allows for modularity, reuse, and repurposing. And I just want to point out that here I've put in concrete string values for, say, the Docker file or memory. These values can be parameterized as well. So let's actually run through an example WDL file. So in this example WDL file, this is an aligner WDL file that I've created, which is going to use the BWA aligner to run a WDL workflow. So in your WDL, you're first going to start out by specifying the WDL version so that Cromwell knows what syntax it needs to understand. And here I've started with my workflow block. Workflow block isn't necessary for all WDL workflows, especially things that are just one task, but I've placed it here just to show people how it would look like. And this workflow is called align read. I'm saying call the BWA align task, and the output of this WDL workflow should be a file. It's an output BAM, and that output is coming from the BWA align task. And then we zoom into the task BWA align. I've defined the inputs. You can see all these inputs are typed. I'm asking for a string that is sample name. I'm asking for the Docker image. Here, see these question marks? That means these are optional values, so they're not necessary to specify. Things like BWA options to pass to the command when I run it. And for this memory option here, I'm asking for a memory optional parameter for memory, but I've set a default value for 4, so it's not specified. I want 4 GB of memory. And everything else is needed for the command to run. For example, the read files I need, the reference files, etc. So this is the actual BWA mem command that is parameterized to accept all the values that I'm passing in my WDL script. I expect the output to be a BAM file, and I'm saying the runtime parameters, I would like a Docker image, which is here. I'm also using a parameterized value, so it will map to that. And then the memory, and you can also add metadata to this WDL file for things like authorship and email. And so these compute requirements that I've specified here, they're not always necessary, sometimes to run the machine. But one case that it is important is when you're trying to, say, run something on Terra. Compute requirements are important in the fact that when you run something on Terra, you're actually provisioning and launching a cloud instance. So parameters specified here might be important to actually provision the resources in the cloud. Okay, so let's look at the parameter JSON example. We have the key value pairs of like how to map it to the parameter from the parameter file to the descriptor and actual value of that parameter file. So this is coming from the workflow name, the task name, and the parameter file, and the actual file value. This can be a path, an integer, or string, and the platforms provide some file provisioning plugins to actually find things like it's living on a GS bucket, an S3 bucket, etc. There's many ways to register content into Dockstore. You basically take those files that you just made and host them in the external site. Or you can host the descriptor on Dockstore itself. And basically, the purpose of this diagram is to show you where content is coming from before it's registered into Dockstore. There's many guides on Dockstore itself to go through this in depth. So earlier question, what problems does this solve? Why do we go through all this trouble? Well, it's to allow for collaboration to size up and scale, and for reproducibility, so that teams of collaborators can work together despite using different compute environments or using genomes from thousands of individuals. And that's made possible because of our interoperable cloud ecosystem that Anvil runs in, and Dockstore is enabled by its usage of APIs to connect to the variety of execution and data storage environments like Terra, DNA Stack, DNA Nexus, and the Cancer Genomics Cloud from 7 Bridges. We also have the Dockstore CLI that can provision this environment. So what this looks like is on the workflows landing page, you can actually launch to those environments that I've just said. For example, the Anvil environment, we can launch this workflow directly to the Terra space by clicking that button and then selecting which workspace that we want to import this workflow for, and then specify, instead of uploading a parameter file or using a parameter file, you can actually just specify the inputs for your workflow here. The Dockstore CLI is another handy developer tool so that you can test things out locally. Dockstore has many other features for language support. For example, to know if your WDL or descriptor file is valid, or to have a DAG visualization of the steps of your workflow coming from the descriptor itself. So one thing we've added to Dockstore is the ability to snapshot and create a DOI using Zenodo for your workflow. So you can use the digital object identifier for your frozen workflows once they've been snapshotted. So you can refer to them from your publication references to enhance reproducibility. We've also released a prototype for apps and services, so you can share more than just the descriptors and containerized descriptors. On Dockstore, soon you'll be able to launch whole genome browsers, imputation servers, things like DICOM viewers, and not just tools and workflows. We have plenty of documentation and tutorials on the Dockstore site itself to go over what I've just gone over today and some other features. But if you need help, we also have a Discuss forum on Dockstore, and the Discuss forum is embedded. Each tool or workflow and documentation entry on Dockstore has an embedded forum, so you can directly ask from there. We also have a general topic that you can post to when linking directly to the Discuss forum. I just want to, at the end here, I just want to say I went through things a little fast today, nowhere near covering everything containers and descriptors can do, but myself and other members of the Anvil community will be hosting workshops at the Bioinformatics Community Conference later next month. Dockstore specifically will be hosting 2 types of workshops, one about containers and descriptors and how to use them in depth. This is a 2.5-hour hands-on workshop to train a beginner. And we'll also be training people on how to use Dockstore and Terra together in depth. I've added the link and I can also post it in the chat. That's it.
Thank you so much, Luis.